In regards to what it says at the very, very end of the Megillah, Ki Mordechai HaYehudi, that Mordechai HaYehudi was the Mishnah to Melech HaChashverosh, then it says, V'rotzui l'roiv echav, he was acceptable or desirable to most of his brothers. The Razal say, l'roiv echav, v'loi l'chol echav, to most of his brothers, but not to all of his brothers. Malamedus teaches us, Shepirshu mimenu mikta Sanhedrin, some of the Sanhedrin had separated from Mordechai. The Rebbe explains, based on the Mefarshim, that Echov, his brothers, refer to his colleagues that were part of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. So this is referring to the people, Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the Sanhedrin. So some of them have actually separated from Mordechai. Why is that? Rashi explains the reason that because Mordechai was batel medivrei Torah, because he neglected some of his Torah study going into government office, this is why some of the Sanhedrin had separated from him. The Gemara then continues. Gadol Talmud Torah is greater Yoitzer Me'atzolas Nefashos, even than saving lives. Why? Where do we see that? Says the Gemara, because in a pasuk in Ezra, Mordechai is counted over there amongst other of the great members of the Sanhedrin, Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, and so on. Mordechai is mentioned as number 5 in the list, so he's mentioned after the 4th person. Eventually, later on in Sefer Nehemiah, where the list is again given, Mordechai is mentioned as the 6th in the list, after 5 other people. And what do we see from here? That he's being mentioned, he was, so to speak, demoted in a certain sense. He went down in rank. And why is that? Because Mordechai became a sar during that time. He had gone into office, and therefore he had gone down in his chashivus by the Chachamim. This is the way Rashi explains it. Says the Rebbe, the question is what's not understood. This idea that Gadol Talmud Torah Yoser Me'atzolas Nefashos, why are we learning it out from these psukim in Ezra and Nehemiah? Chazal seemingly could have learned it out from the simple reading in our pasuk in the Megillah itself, where it says l'roiv echav, that he was only accepted now by most of his brothers, which we understood that as meaning that some of the Sanhedrin had parted ways with him. So why did they part ways? Why did they separate? As we said before, because of batel medivrei Torah, because they looked at it as an inyan of bitul Torah for hatzolas nefashis, for saving lives. That itself seemingly should be enough of a proof that Talmud Torah is greater than hatzolas nefashis. So why is it that the Gemara needs to learn this from the fact that Mordechai's name appears in a different order somewhere else, not in the Megillah, not in Megillah Esther, but in 2 different psukim of 2 different svarim in Tanakh. So why couldn't we learn it out from the pasuk in Megillah Esther itself, and a direct pasuk? So there are Mefarshim that say that from the wording of the Megillah itself, all we would be able to learn was that some of the Sanhedrin consider Talmud Torah greater than saving lives. Because who separated from him? We said Miktzah Sanhedrin, some of the Sanhedrin. It's still no proof that from Shamayim, from heaven, they agreed to this attitude. And this is why the Gemara brings a pasuk where Torah itself is hinting to this idea by changing the order of where Mordechai appears in the psukim. Says the Rebbe, but this answer, at least al derech hapshat, is not so smooth. Because who are the ones that separated from Mordechai in the Megillah? These are people that are members of the Sanhedrin. These are not just ordinary people. Obviously, the members of the Sanhedrin are acting. Their whole inyan is about halacha. They're acting according to the halacha of Torah. So why would that not be enough of a proof that heaven also agrees, that Hashem also agrees, that this is the right perspective, that this is the right attitude, that Atzolas Nefashos, that Talmud Torah comes before Atzolas Nefashos. Why do we again need those other psukim in Ezra and Nehemiah? Another thing, says the Rebbe, what's hard to understand, and some other points. The Rebbe says, number 1, since Gadol Talmud Torah Yoser Me'atzolas Nefashos, if that's the case, why is Mordechai's name only, because he's not learning Torah now, why is it only being moved one level, one rank further in the order of the names, being counted as number 5 as number 6 instead of number 5, being counted as after the 5th person instead of after the 4th person? Seemingly his name should totally not be counted as part of the members of the Sanhedrin. The whole idea of Sanhedrin is to paskin in Torah. If Mordechai is no longer involved to that same extent in Torah, why is he even being counted at all? Another thing, says the Rebbe, what's not understood is, from the implication of the psukim, from the simple reading of the psukim, This idea that Mordechai was in government office as Mishnah Lamelech, as second to the king, this was over a longer period of time, and during this whole time would have been this situation that he's only acceptable, he's only desirable, he's only in agreement with with most of his brothers, but not with some of his brothers. Some of the Sanhedrin were separated from him. So the question is, either way you look at it, there seems to be a problem. Either Mordechai should have proved his way, that his way is al pi Torah, and then the rest of the Sanhedrin should agree with him, or the other way around, he should give up his position in government, and then once again be accepted by all of his brothers, by all of the Sanhedrin. Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this by first looking at the diuk, at the wording within the same pasuk, within the same words of the Megillah that Razal are darshaning, and the way they darshan it. What does the pasuk say? Rotzui l'roiv echav, that he was acceptable to most of his brothers. So who's the ones that separate from him? Only some of the Sanhedrin, Mikza Sanhedrin, are separating from him, which tells us clearly, really, that most of the Sanhedrin actually agree to the Anhag of Mordechai, because only some of them separate from him. Says the Rebbe, this will then explain to us very simply why we say that even though some of the Sanhedrin separated from him, that's still not going to be a proof that Talmud Torah is greater than Atzalas Nefashos, because again, it's only some of the Sanhedrin of that opinion. On the contrary, we can actually learn exactly the other way around, that since the Roiv of the Sanhedrin are agreeing with Mordechai, are happy with Mordechai's conduct, that means they actually agree with Mordechai that Hatzalas Nefashos is greater. And this is why the Gemara is going to need these other psukim in Ezra and Nehemiah to show us that Mordechai's name goes down in rank. The Rebbe says, well, this will also be explained why we say his name only goes down one rank further, and not that he's completely dismissed from the Sanhedrin, because as we said, actually most of the Sanhedrin agree with Mordechai's behavior. But, says the Rebbe, if that's the case, the question now becomes the other way around. Number one, if Mordechai's behavior is in agreement with the opinion of most of the Sanhedrin, then seemingly that should have outweighed the minority of the Sanhedrin. So why are we saying that Pirshu Mimenu, that they're separating from him? Why aren't they just now being mevatel, canceling, nullifying their opinion to the majority? And number two, says the Rebbe, according to this, it would now seem that the two Maimorei Chazal that the Gemara brings, following one from the other in one continuation, on the one hand was saying that some of the Sanhedrin separated, which means clearly only some of the Sanhedrin, that most of the Sanhedrin agree with Mordechai, which would mean that they agree that Hatzalas Nefashos seemingly is greater. And then you immediately bring the Gemara that says, Gadol Talmud Torah Yoser me'Hatzalas Nefashos, proving it from the Psukim in Ezra and Nehemiah. So now these two Maimorei Razal seem to be actually in contradiction with each other. Says the Rebbe, the general explanation over here is going to be looking at another diuk in this Maimor Chazal, the wording Pirshu Mimenu Mikza Sanhedrin, that some of the Sanhedrin had separated. It doesn't say Cholku Alav, it doesn't say that they argued. It doesn't even say Ein Ruach Mikzas Chachamim Noichemene, that some of the Chachamim were not happy with Mordechai, or a similar expression. What does Pirshu mean? We're not speaking about a machloikas, because even according to their opinion, they weren't saying that Mordechai's behavior is not in accordance with Torah. Rather, they're saying, they're separating, meaning they have a different path, they have a different way than Mordechai's behavior and the shita of the other Sanhedrin, and their way is not the same way as his way. But even they're agreeing that Mordechai's hanhaga in regards to himself is a way al pi Torah. In other words, they're saying this isn't the way that Sanhedrin should be, but they're still, that's the way they see it, but they're still agreeing that Mordechai's way is, at least for himself, a path of Torah. How do we understand this? How do we understand that they're both valid, they're both acceptable ways? Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this by first looking at a story of the famous Ragatchover Goin and the way he behaved in this particular story, and with the explanation on the story. And the Rebbe relates, after the Frierdiker Rebbe left Russia and arrived to Riga, so he called a meeting of Rabbonim and leaders, communal workers, activists, for the benefit of the Russian Yidden. Amongst those that were invited was the Rogatchover. Now, by this meeting, they wanted to make a particular vad, they wanted to make a committee that's going to get together every once in a while to discuss how to deal, what to do, how to work for the benefit of the Russian Yidden. They asked the Rogatchover that he too should be part of this committee. The Rogatchover refused, and he explained that to get involved with this committee is going to depend, in other words, whether he should get involved, it's going to depend on an argument between the Talmud Bavli and Talmud Yerushalmi. The Gemara says in Brachos, Chasidim or Rishonim, the early Chasidim, the early pious people, Hayushoyim, they spent 9 hours a day davening. The Gemara asks, if that's the case, Toirason heich mishtameres, how is their Torah going to be preserved? How are they going to retain their Torah? Umelachton heich anasis, how is their malacha, their work? How is that going to get done? The Gemara responds and says, Mitoich shechasidim heim, that because they are Chasidim, they are pious people, so Toirasa mishtameres, their Torah will be protected, their Torah will be preserved. Umelachton mizbareches, and there will be a bracha in their work. Now, that's in the Bavli. The Yerushalmi brings the same idea, but with a little bit of a difference. Instead of saying that because they are Chasidim, Toirasa mishtameres, and melachton mizbareches, so the Yerushalmi says that because they were Chasidim, there was a bracha in their Torah and a bracha in their work. What's the difference between Toirasa mishtameres and bracha nitenes b'toirasan? So the Rebbe says the difference is very simple. Mishtameres means that they're not forgetting their learning. So they learn something, they don't have to spend as much time reviewing it, going it over, they're not going to forget it. But it doesn't mean that they're going to be gaining and benefiting new Torah. In other words, whatever they managed to learn in the bit of time they had, and they're not during the time that they're not davening, so that Torah is going to be retained. But what is bracha nitenes b'Torah? On the Yerushalmi, what does it mean that it's a bracha in their Torah? So the Rebbe is quoting from the Mefarshim over here that they managed to understand what they learned immediately. It didn't take them any time. In other words, there was a special bracha over it. Not only weren't they forgetting what they did learn, but there's actually a haisafa, there's addition in their understanding of Torah. In the little bit of time that they're learning, they are being successful to understand something immediately, something that usually, based on each individual's nature, would have taken them a much longer time in their limud Torah. So in this short amount of time they're learning, they're actually gaining what they would have gained over many hours of learning. So the Rogatchover concluded and he applied the same thing idea. And he said, if he's now going to be involved in these meetings and these committees, he's clearly going to have to take off some time from his learning of Torah. So now, says the Rogatchover, according to the Yerushalmi, that like by those Chasidim, that there was a bracha given into their Torah, so he's not going to lose out anything in his knowledge of Torah, because he will gain in a short amount of time what usually would have taken him a much longer amount of time. But according to the Bavli, and we say that the halacha is kebavli, where what's going to happen is only Torah and Mishtameres, that the Torah that he learns would be retained, would be preserved. So he's going to lack all of that extra learning that he could have learned had he had all this extra time. And for that, he's not ready to give up that for that learning of Torah that he doesn't want to lose out on. Says the Rebbe, to explain this machloikas between the Bavli and Yerushalmi, we're actually going to have a look at the general difference between Bavli and Yerushalmi, the style of learning. The style of learning of Talmud Bavli is with lots of shaklavataria. There's lots of back and forth, give and take, questions and answers. As the Gemara itself says, on the pasuk b'machashakim oishivani, that Hashem has sat me down in the dark, refers to the learning of Bavel. The learning of Bavel is similar to a person that's in the dark, where you need to search, you need to put in a lot of work to find something. In a similar way, you're asking questions, you're sorting through things until you finally come to the emes, to the true understanding and the end result. But in Talmud Yerushalmi, the learning is in a much straighter, more direct way. It's like the lights are turned on. you immediately find and you see the correct svara, the correct idea and the correct answer, like someone that's seeing something in the light. It's not dark. Says the Rebbe, from what follows from this, that according to the style, the way of learning of Talmud Bavli, so it's actually the most you could manage to do if you learn in a small amount of time, like the Chassidim or Rishonim are doing. So the most that could be is that Torah should be remembered. Torah and Mishtameres. They shouldn't forget the Torah that they learned. But there's no way that you could say that Bracha Nitenes B'Seirason, that in a little bit of learning they should immediately understand it right away. That totally doesn't fit with the style of Bavli. That's not the way we understand things. We need to work it through over a long process, a lot of time. But according to the Shita and the way of learning of the Yerushalmi says you could have a situation that Bracha Nitenes B'Seirason, that you could manage to understand, you can be successful and understand in a short amount of time immediately the end result. And this fits very much with the whole style of the Yerushalmi, learning in the direct way, that you immediately come to the things the way they are at the end. Says that, but now we're going to go back to understand the difference between Mordechai, that most of the Sanhedrin actually agreed with him, and then the other Sanhedrin, some of the Sanhedrin, that didn't agree with him, or that didn't have it, didn't go in his style. We said Pirshum, it doesn't mean they didn't agree that it's a way in Halacha, in Torah, but they weren't on that, didn't have that Seder Avodah. This is going to be dependent on this difference between the Bavli and Yerushalmi. Says the Rebbe, the Sanhedrin, Mordechai is part of the Sanhedrin, Sanhedrin Gedolah, the great Sanhedrin. How were they chosen? They were chosen from the smaller Sanhedrins that started off, this is a Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim, a smaller Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim, or at least in other parts of Eretz HaKodesh, the Holy Land of Eretz Yisrael. From there they were taken up to Yerushalayim and to the Sanhedrin, to the big Sanhedrin. Says the Rebbe, so it makes sense to say that their style of learning, or at least the majority of them, was similar to the learning of Yerushalmi. Because remember, this is again, they're in Eretz Yisrael, they're in Yerushalayim. Especially when we're speaking about in the time of the Mishnah, the Anshe Knesset Sagdoila. But there are also other members in the Sanhedrin. There are also Tanoim, even in Eretz Yisrael, there were some Tanoim from Bavel. Similar to what we find in later generations, in the time of Hillel, it says Hillel came up from Bavel. We know there's Rab Nosson HaBavli and others. Especially, says the Rebbe, at the time of the story of Mordechai, we know it's already 70 years since the time that the Pasuk describes HaChorosh v'Hamasger, which, as Rashi explains, the Gemara explains, this is a reference to the very great Talmidei Chachamim of the Anshe Knesset Sagdoila, people that had gone out of Yerushalayim with the Golus, with Yechonia, they went to Bavel. So we have now a situation that in the Anshe Knesset Sagdoila, we have the people that were taken in captivity by Nebuchadnezzar Melech Bavel, and now they are returning to Yerushalayim, to Yehuda, in the first year of Achashverosh. This is 52 years. After 52 years that were in Bavel, so we have different groups of people, some after longer periods, shorter periods, etc. But furthermore, the Rebbe says, even from the original people, as they were in Yerushalayim, there were some of them that were perhaps on that level, of the Bavli type of level, as we said. So we have, again, in the Sanhedrin, we have many people that are going to be more in the Yerushalmi style of learning, but you also have people that were in Bavel, spent many years in Bavel, coming from Bavel, etc., and therefore more on the Bavli level of learning. Therefore, Mordechai and most of the Sanhedrin are of the opinion that he needs to become the Mishnah Lamelech, the second to the king, in order to save lives. What's going to be? How is it then possible that he should remain in the Sanhedrin and be part of the Anshe Knesset Sagdoila, that their Inyan is obviously learning and teaching, instruction? So going back to the Yerushalmi, because they are Hasidim, they have a special bracha in their Torah, so therefore he's going to have such amazing success, not only in a way that he's going to retain and remember what he learned in the little bit of time that he still could learn Torah, but rather, as we said, he can immediately understand things, immediately have this bracha to grow in his learning, the bit of time that he has for learning, the exact amount that he would have had he not been part of the government office now and helping Yidden. He would still have gaining in all of that Torah. During that time when he's learning, he'll have the bracha in it. However, amongst the Sanhedrin, again, we said there's at least some, that their style of learning is more the way of Bavli, as mentioned, and therefore by them, what would happen if they go into the way they view going into office and helping other people? It would be Torasa Mishtameres. The most that would happen is that the Torah they learned will be retained, and therefore spending time on askonas, on communal work, and atzalas nefashos, is going to remove from them the ability to adding more in their knowledge of Torah, which is what's needed by Sanhedrin, and therefore Pirshu Mimen Mikza Sanhedrin, some of the Sanhedrin, which cannot have that same level of avodah as Mordechai and many of the other Sanhedrin, so they separate in their own path. In other words, they're going in a different path, saying we need to stick exclusively to the Limud HaTorah, as mentioned earlier. Says the Rebbe, even though according to the Shita of the Yerushalmi, that Beracha Nitenes B'Torason, and therefore Mordechai has Torah, and he has his addition in learning Torah and so on, nevertheless, we now have these other psukim of Ezra and Nehemiah, which tell us that he still went down in rank by the Chachamim because he's bottom of Divrei Torah, because at the end of the day he's not completely learning Torah and he's in office. What does that mean? Says the Rebbe, because even though there is a special Maila, because there is, nevertheless, says the Rebbe, because the bottom line is there's still going to be something unique and special if you have the concept of Torasam Umnasam, of really learning Torah the whole time, not to stop the Limud HaTorah for anything, not even if the bottom line is I'm not even going to be missing in my knowledge of Torah because there's going to be this extra bracha. And the bottom line is, but it's still not Torasam Umnasam. Says the Rebbe, this is the pshat now of the next Maimer Chazal that says, Godel Talmud Torah Yoiser Me'atzalas Nefashos. In other words, there's a certain godless, there's a certain godel, there's a certain greatness in dedicating oneself completely to Limud HaTorah, which now Mordechai doesn't have, even though, again, technically, he's not missing out, but he doesn't have this Torah Soyim Nasai, and therefore, since Mordechai is missing this particular godless, so that's why there's also a Yerida, there's a certain, in a certain sense, he goes down in his Chashivus by the Chachamim in rank, that instead of being mentioned as number 5 after 4 other great people, he's mentioned after, not be mentioned after 4, not be mentioned as 5th, so he's mentioned as 6th after 5. So why does Mordechai do this? Says the Rebbe, but nevertheless Mordechai and most of the Sanhedrin agree that he still needs to be the Mishnah Lamelech, even though he's missing out on this idea of Torah Soyim Nasai, because even though he's going to be missing this greatness of the Godel Talmud Torah, how great Talmud Torah is, he's of the opinion, and most of the Sanhedrin are of the opinion, that for the sake of Atzolas Nefashos, it is worth it to have this Yerida, in order to be, as the Pasuk says, Doirish Tov La'am, seeking good for his people, V'doiver Shalom L'chol Zari. Now, says the Rebbe, the question still remains, and that is, there's still something not smooth over here. So it's all very nice. Bracha Nitenes B'Torah, and Mordechai is not going to be missing in his knowledge of Torah in all of the additional Torah that he should have had, and he could have had, and he does have because of that bracha. All very nice. It's also true there's a special Maila in Atzolas Nefashos, and for that it's even worth it, the Yerida, to go down in rank because he doesn't have Torah Soyim Nasai. But the question is now, but how does he remain part of the Sanhedrin? Seemingly the whole idea of the Sanhedrin is exclusively Limud HaTorah. It's all about Torah and Hayra, teaching the others Torah. So what's going on over here? Or to put this question in slightly a different way, says the Rebbe, how is it possible that on the Sanhedrin themselves, which their inyan in essence is Torah, and yet there could be an obligation to, so to speak, forego this mile of Torah Nasam in order to save lives? How do the two go together? Says the Rebbe, the explanation is based on a Tana Devei Eliyahu. The Tana Devei Eliyahu says the following: Haya lohem, that the real right attitude of the Sanhedrin should have been, what's the right way how Sanhedrin should be behaving? Leilech, they should have been going around, Liksher chavolim shel barzel b'mosneim, tying iron chains, iron ropes around their waists, lifting up their clothes above their knees. In other words, making sure the clothes are not getting in the way as they walk. Or perhaps maybe, as we say today, roll up your sleeves. But the point is, they should have been going around all the Yiddish cities, teaching the Yidden the right ways and so on. What does this tell us? So the Rebbe says, we know that there's a halacha that the Sanhedrin, once they're not in their permanent place, like in the Beis HaMikdash and the Lishkas HaGazis, or as it ever points out in the footnotes in the different various times where their permanent place is, Sanhedrin have to actually go down in rank. They cannot paskin anymore now capital case punishments, dini nefashos. That means by the fact that you're saying that where should have the Sanhedrin been, going around all the Yidden, encouraging the Yidden, getting the Yidden to do the right things, they're actually losing some of their high position of being Sanhedrin. And yet, what do we say? Hoyolem, this is the obligation, this is what they should have really been doing, going around the Yiddish cities, helping the Yidden become better Yidden. What does this tell us? That the main job of Sanhedrin really is about Hirah l'Rabim. It's about teaching the public, instructing them, in that way saving them clearly. And for this they even need to go down in rank, even from their strength and power of Sanhedrin, in order to be Mezakeh Harabim, to bring schus to the public, to the community. Says the Rebbe, in a similar way, we can now explain in our case by Mordechai, that even though it's true that Mordechai is becoming a Mishnah L'Melech through this, he's having a Yerida in his Chashivas as member of Sanhedrin. As we said, he's going down in rank from being mentioned after the fourth, he's being mentioned after the fifth. He's missing this mile of Teirasai Nasai. And nevertheless, not only do we say this Yerida is worth it, but even from the perspective of Sanhedrin, from the idea of what Sanhedrin is supposed to be. Because it's Toivas Harabim, it's to be Mezakeh the Rabbim, to save the Rabbim, similar to what we just explained from the Tana Dvelio. The Rebbe now comes and applies it closer home, closer to our days, and to our way of being. The Rebbe starts with the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Rebbe says the conduct of the Frierdiker Rebbe was that he, so to speak, robbed from the time that he could have been spending on Limud HaTorah for himself, Avodas Hashem for himself, and during that time, he was involved with Askanos, with communal affairs, and Atzalas Nefasha, saving people. And furthermore, he demanded this also from a large portion, a Chelek Chashav of his Talmidim and Mukrusharim, that they too should be acting in this way. The Frierdiker Rebbe had instituted that even Talmidei HaYeshiva should, at least Bein Asdorim, in between the time of Seder, give some of their time to spread Torah and Yiddishkeit chutzah to the outside. And in what way was this done? Not always was it that they were actually learning and teaching people. Some of the time was spent, and a big part of the time was spent, not only on learning, but also on what we call tzarchei tzibur, trying to get more talmidim, trying to organize a place for learning, trying to get the necessary funds to cover the expenses, and so on and so forth. In other words, even such mekusharim that based on their level, they might only be on the level of Talmud Bavli, which means by them being occupied with all of these askanos, it's only going to be maximum Teirasa Mishameres. They're going to remember what they learned. They're not going to gain the extra learning. And nevertheless, the Frierdiker Rebbe wanted that they too should spend this time, even in a way that through this they're going to be lacking in Limud HaTorah and Avodas Hashem, but for the sake of Toivas HaRabbim, the benefit of the Rabbim. Because, let's go back to the Rogatchover. The Rogatchover refused to take part. Says the Rebbe, this avoid of the Rogatchover is only for Yechidei Sgula. In every generation, you have certain people that they're on the level of Toirasam Umnasam, that Torah is their sole occupation. And they are like those Miktzah Sanhedrin, like some of the Sanhedrin, that didn't agree with Mordechai. In other words, they are on that level that they just need to be involved in learning the whole time, and adding in their knowledge of learning the whole time in a constant way. And so this is certain people. But the Seder Avodah, says the Rebbe, by the majority of people, even the Bnei Torah, is as the halach is, that Bezman Hazeh really, you don't have this Torah, some of the Torah is his absolute only occupation. And says the Rebbe, if a person would be mevatel his learning for other things, so how much more so? Absolutely, we need to stop our learning at times for hatzolas nefashos, for saving lives and the benefit of the Rabbim. Now, says the Rebbe, just to point out, regarding the Frierdiker Rebbe himself, says the Rebbe, mi yodeya, who even could understand his oifen of avodah. Especially, it's known a Torah of the Baal Shem Tov. On the pasuk it says, kumi oiri. So this pasuk is Hashem telling the Yidden, get up and shine. Kiva oirech, your light came. Uchvoid Hashem olayich zarach, the glory of Hashem is shining on you. Baal Shem Tov translated it, referring to the Nesiyah Yisrael. The Baal Shem Tov says, you, the Nesiyah Yisrael, the leaders of the Yidden, that you're putting away your Torah avodah for the benefit of the Rabbim. So what's going to be with you? So we say, kumi oiri, you're going to shine. you're going to have the individual light, you're going to have the greater light. In other words, Nesi'ei Yisrael have a special bracha that they won't be lacking in their Torah v'avodah, and Adrabah, their light comes, Hashem's glory shines in them, etc., which is even a much higher level than the idea that bracha is given into their Torah. Says the Rebbe, the Haira, from the Anhaga of Mordechai for us, B'negei L'poil. And as the famous Torah of the Baal Shem Tov, regarding what the Mishnah says, that HaKoyres HaMegillah L'mafreya Lo Yotza, simply it means if you read the Megillah backwards, the second chapter before the first. But the Baal Shem Tov translated, if someone's reading the Megillah backwards in the sense of time, that he's reading the Megillah as if it's only a story of the past, but it's not, doesn't have a current today's relevance today, so then he's lo yatsa. So what does this all mean to us today? That what's demanded from us is this type of behavior, at least somewhat similar to this conduct of Mordechai, to become a Mishnah Lamelech, in other words, in the sense of going out there, being doirish toiv la'amai, seeking the good of all of the people, of all of the Yidden, doiver shalom l'chol zaroi, and trying to make peace, trying to bring peace, speak peacefully to all Yidden, bringing peace everywhere. Even if for this, maybe some Yidden won't even agree with our ways. Will be ratzui, maybe acceptable only to roi vechav, and there'll be some that don't see this way of avodah. Says the Rebbe furthermore, and even though that for many people this is going to be a yerida, like we said by Mordechai, he's now going down in rank, we may have to give up in some way on our own shleimus, nevertheless it's still worth the yerida, for the benefit and the good of the Rabbim. The Rebbe says, in fact, we find this even in the individual's life of every person, also as a yachid, as an individual. The Rebbe says a person's neshama comes down, what's called me'igra rama lebira mikta, like from a high rooftop to a low pit, from a very high place to a very low place. And what's the idea? So first of all, he has to overcome his own goof, his own nefesh habahamis, the portion in the world, conquer it, make it for a dira for Hashem. So that's one level, one area. Then there's another area. The Yid has to then go ahead and go get married. And as it says in the Megillah, what's going to happen? Liyos is called ish soirer beveisoi. As the Maimon Chazal says, Ezeu ish aksheira ha'oise ritzoin baila. So again, so now there's a certain level where he's like the Mishnah Lamelech in a certain sense, where he has to rule, but this is again some sort of yerida. Chazal actually say, nechiz darga nesiv itza. That in a certain sense, you're going down in rank by going ahead and taking care of the family now, marrying a wife, etc., etc. But the person needs to forgo all of his own personal benefits for the benefit of his family. Says the Rebbe, this is also the explanation in what we find that there's actually a certain advantage in those that are oisig b'tzarchei tzibur, even over those that toirasam umnasam. And that is, those that are toirasam umnasam need to stop their Torah in order to lay in Kriya Shema. But those that are oisig b'tzarchei tzibur don't stop for anything, not even for Kriya Shema. The Rebbe explains, because since by doing tzarchei tzibur be'amunah, on the one hand, you are lacking in your limud HaTorah and your own shleimus, to the extent that the Chazal say, Hatel alein tzarchei tzibur vein kolen me'alein, that sometimes by putting tzarchei tzibur on someone, this itself could, so to speak, finish him off. And nevertheless, this is specifically the way. It's dafke in this way, and through this you get this amazing milah of the toivas harabim, because you're dealing and helping the public. And the Rebbe says, if this was true, that this way of Mordechai was there in order to save the Yiddish bodies, and yet it's all worth it. How much more so that this is the way it needs to be when we're concerned with the Yiddish and neshamois, that we need to put away all of our shleimus, all of our great ideas and all of our great things, for the atzalas nefashis, to save the neshamas and be a doiver shalom l'chol zaroi, until such time there will become that Yisrael lois in tshuva, that all the Yidden do tshuva, and immediately they'll be redeemed b'karev mamash.